Part 21, Chapter 11. Macready had never been so glad to see anything happen in his life as he was to see the lights come back on. Palmer crawled out from beneath the now humming generator, wiping grease off on his pants. That should hold it for now, until Childs can get down here and bolt it properly. Where to? Rec room, Macready told him tersely. He was reluctant to abandon the generator room, but had to content himself with slapping a heavy padlock on the door as they exited. The rec room was crowded by the time they arrived. The congestion, the presence of human bodies, was comforting after the long minutes spent alone with the generator. Neighbour studied neighbour. Palmer, Knowles, and Sanders spread themselves out as far as possible, putting distance between themselves and everyone else. Norris and Childs were using nylon ropes to tie the doctor, Clark, and Gary to the couch. Macready cursed himself for not ordering it done sooner. Too late now. He forced himself not to think of what might have happened if he hadn't been able to come up with a replacement fuel pump for the generator. As Norris and Childs worked on the 3 prisoners, Macready fiddled with the little propane burners he'd scavenged from supply. They'd be dangerous to operate, but he trusted the makeshift blowtorches more than any of the guns. "Where were the flashlights?" Sanders was asking him. "What happened to all the flashlights, man?" "Screw the flashlights," Macready growled at him. "Where the hell were you?" I panicked again, Mac. Just started running, trying to get away." "I'm sorry." "De nada. Forget it." He rose, hefted one of the small torches, and looked over toward Palmer. "I think these will work. One of your better ideas." "Thanks, Mac. But when I was getting the burner tips out of supply, I noticed something else. It reminded me that I couldn't find the magneto from Chopper 1. There's tons of stuff missing. Cables, wire, microprocessor chips, all kinds of shit. I didn't think anything of it until I remembered the missing piece from the chopper." "Now that's funny." Knowles stepped away from the wall. "I've been missing stuff from the kitchen too. I didn't say anything about it because I didn't think it was important. I mean, what the hell would anybody want with a food processor?" Macready surveyed the room, counting heads. "Anybody see Fuchs or hear him?" Nobody had. That was clear from the expressions on their faces, as well as the silence. Childs was glaring at the station manager as he started to tie the man's arms behind his back. "Where did you go to when the lights went out, huh, Chief?" Gary was still woozy from the effects of the morphine. "It was dark. Find a light." "You lying bastard!" Gary fought the ropes, struggled to his feet. His words were slurred. "I rather don't like your tone." He reached up a free hand and grabbed Childs by the collar. "You sit back down!" The mechanic wailed the station manager with a powerful right hand. Gary managed to half duck the blow, put his head into the bigger man's chest, and threw his weight to one side. The 2 of them fell backwards over the couch, almost taking Copper with them. Macready and Norris dove in immediately, the pilot grabbing Childs and Norris wrestling with the dazed but still dangerous station manager. "Easy, Chief. That's enough. Take it easy! Somehow, Macready managed to shove Childs to one side. Stop it, man! You hear me? This is just what it wants. Are you fighting for it or against it? Childs was holding up a fist the size of a toaster. He stared blankly at the pilot as he digested the latter's words. The fist dropped slowly, and the mechanic inhaled deeply. When he spoke again, he sounded embarrassed. I'm sorry, Mac. I wasn't thinking. But he continued to glare at the station manager. They were interrupted by a rumbling sound from above. High wind battered at the roofing. Macready glanced at the ceiling and released Childs. You all hear that? He gazed around the room. I checked Bennings's charts. The storm's going to start ripping any minute. So we don't have much time. Time for what? Norris wanted to know. Macready walked over to the card table and began distributing the portable blowtorches. He shoved the first one into Norris's stomach. We've got to find Fuchs. When we find him, we kill him. Sanders looked shocked. Why? If he was still one of us, he'd have come back here by now. The lights have been on long enough. He hasn't. So that means that he can't, or he doesn't want to, because he isn't Fuchs anymore. If he has become one of those things, we've got to get him before he changes into whatever it can change into. Know what I think? I think it's tired of playing around. It knows we've got it stuck here, so there's no reason for it to keep lying low in hopes of stealing a copter or a snowmobile. The only way it can survive now is by making sure we can't finish it off. That means taking care of us. If it can't do that as a man, it may try doing it as itself. Remember, we've got less than an hour. I wish I knew how much less. He looked to his right. Knowles, you and Childs and I will check the outside shacks. He tossed torches to Palmer and Sanders. You two search the compound. Stay together. Palmer turned a wary gaze on the radio operator. I ain't going with Sanders. Sanders's head snapped towards the backup pilot. Something wrong with me, man? Palmer ignored him, avoiding his eyes. I ain't going with him. I'll go with Childs. Well, fuck you, man! I ain't going with you! Palmer's voice was on the edge of hysteria. Well, who says I want you going with me? Childs put in gruffly. Macready stepped between them, angry and out of patience. Cut the bullshit! We haven't got the time for this. How many times have I got to tell you guys that that's just the way the thing wants us to act? Afraid of each other, paranoid. We cut each other's throats and it'll sit back off to the side and laugh itself silly. Palmer looked like the kid who got caught with his hand in the fudge. Yeah, I know. But I still ain't going with Sanders. Okay. Macready made no effort to conceal his disgust. Sanders, you come with us. Norris, you stay here. He turned to confront the men tied on the couch. Any of them move, you fry 'em. And if you hear anything at all that doesn't sound kosher, you let loose with that siren. We all meet back here in 20 minutes regardless." He lowered his voice meaningfully. "And everybody watches everybody else. Don't get mad, don't fight. Just watch." His eyes met those of close friends. "All clear? Then let's move." The three men paused above the stairs. The wind blew balefully around them. At least the outside lights were back on, though flashlights were still necessary to illuminate the wooden walkway. "Okay, watch yourselves now," Macready warned them. A powerful gust of wind gave impetus to his words. "The storm will be on us any minute. I don't want to be stuck out here when it hits. Sanders, you check the chemical storage shed." The radio operator nodded and started off to his right across a walkway buried beneath half an inch of slick snow. "Come on, Knowles." With the cook at his side, the pilot headed up the walkway, leaning into the wind. He'd gone about a yard before he slipped and nearly fell. The flashlight beam was too weak to penetrate the ice-filled night. "Light up!" he yelled at Knowles. The cook nodded. Each man pulled a flare from his pocket, twisted the head to set it alight. The intense glow brightened their path considerably. They shuffled onward towards Blair's shed. The guide ropes that flanked the walkway were all that kept them headed in the right direction. Childs opened the door carefully and peered into the exposed room. Empty. He closed the door quietly, moved a few yards down the hallway, and opened the divider. The corridor ahead was also deserted. "What did we ever do to these things anyway?" a voice said close behind him. The mechanic whirled and glared down at Palmer. The pilot had been mumbling to himself and had fallen a few steps behind his companion. The abruptness of Childs's move brought Palmer to a startled halt. "What?" "Don't walk behind me." Walk behind? Realization dawned. Normally, Palmer could let his mind drift languorously, but not now. This wasn't the time for idle introspection. "Oh yeah, right." He moved up until he was standing next to the opposite wall, across from the mechanic. "This better?" "Much better," Childs agreed. He moved past the divider and into the next section of corridor. They continued that way, neither man advancing ahead of or falling far behind his partner. The jerky, awkward mutual lockstep did nothing to lessen the tension between them. The wind howled around the walls of the shack as Knowles and Macready stopped in front of the door. The pilot glanced around the left side of the building, then the right. None of the boards covering the windows appeared to have been disturbed. "Let's keep it quiet," Knowles urged him. "Maybe the thing's walking around out here, listening for—" Macready shook his head and spoke brusquely. "It's got more sense than that, and if it didn't, you couldn't hear it anyway. Not over this wind." Norls licked his lips, cursing himself when a crust of ice immediately formed over them. He eyed the heavy boards sealing the shed door. "So what do we do? Go on in?" "Not unless we have to." The little port set in the door was completely clouded over. Macready squinted at it while Norls danced behind him, as much from nervousness as a desire to keep warm. "You see anything?" Macready stared a moment longer, then finally shook his head. "Too steamed up. The side windows should be clearer. Come on." Huddled close to the wall, they moved around the left side. The force of the wind abated slightly in the lee of the shed. The gap between two of the 1x4s was also fogged up, but not as badly as the glass in the doorway. Macready peered inside. Blair was seated at the central table, barely visible in the pale glow from the single weak bulb dangling overhead. He was spooning food out of a can. A hangman's noose hung stark and ready from one of the ceiling beams. Macready put his mouth close to the glass, careful not to let his lips come in contact with it. "Hey, Blair!" The biologist jumped up, knocking over his chair and spilling the can of food. His agitated expression belied his seeming serenity. He searched wildly for the source of the shout before his gaze came to rest on the side window. "Mac, is that you?" "Yeah, me and Norls. Take it easy, Blair." At this reassurance, the biologist appeared to relax slightly. He walked over to the window and stared out at the pilot. His eyes were red and lined, his hair unkempt, and his clothing disheveled. Macready thought he looked terrible. "What do you want, Mac?" "Has Fuchs been out here?" Macready studied the other man closely, trying to determine if he was still likely to go on another mad binge. He couldn't decide, even wished Copper was present. But Copper was under suspicion. "I've changed my mind," he told Macready. I'd like to come back inside. I don't want to stay out here anymore. I hear funny things out here." "I'll bet you do," thought Macready silently. "The trouble is, you were hearing them before you were put out here." "I asked if you've seen Fuchs." Blair made an effort and forced himself to consider Macready's question. "Fuchs? No, it's not Fuchs. You must let me back in. I won't harm anyone, I promise. You have all the guns hidden away by now, I'm sure. I can't do any more damage to anything." "We'll see about it, Blair." Macready turned from the window. "Got a couple of other things to check out first." Norls followed the pilot away from the shed. Blair's panicky voice followed them. "I promise! I'm much better now. I'll be good. I'm all right. Don't leave me here, Mac. Mac, don't you leave me out here!" The wind swallowed the rest of his screams as Macready and Norls moved a little faster. Norris was tired. The past couple of days had been rough. He wasn't as young as most of the guys, nor as healthy. He kept his attention split between the sedated trio slumped on the couch and the several entrances to the recreation room. A dull ache throbbed in his chest. He rubbed his sternum reflexively, wincing. "I'm getting worried about you," Copper said thickly from the couch. "You ought to have an EKG." Norris self-consciously moved his hand away from his chest and tried to sound unconcerned. "Let's not worry about anything else just now." The doctor yawned, not entirely the result of the sedation. He was exhausted too. "Okay, after we get this mess squared away then. First thing." Norris nodded agreeably. Something made a noise outside the kitchen end doorway, and he jerked sharply in that direction. It came again, faint and mechanical. Relay switching over, he decided, relaxing again. He looked back at the doctor and murmured, "After all this mess." The wind outside was no longer merely strong. It had turned decidedly vicious. MacReady and Knowles had to use the guide ropes to drag themselves along as they made agonizingly slow progress towards the pilot's shed. The gentle slope seemed like a 60-degree climb. They used both flashlights and flares now. The only sign of life was provided by the dull orange glow of the exterior lights, impotently trying to penetrate the blowing snow. A violent gust knocked MacReady off his feet. He hung onto the rope with both hands as his legs went out from under him. His boots kicked at the snow. He was on his back, half on the boardwalk and half lying on white oblivion. The wind tore at him, trying to loosen his grip. Knowles stopped as the pilot's flashlight and flare were blown towards him. He dove for the light, gripping the rope with his other hand, and managed to catch it before the wind carried it out of sight. MacReady fought to get back onto his feet. He was painfully aware of his vulnerability, lying there on his back against the slippery ice. Knowles was coming towards him, pulling himself along the ropes. The pilot stared through battered goggles at the younger man. The cook a surreal vision in snow-caked parka and boots. Then Knowles bent and handed over the flashlight. Trying not to show his relief, MacReady finally managed to pull himself upright again. "Thanks!" he shouted above the wind. Knowles just nodded. Together they resumed their hike towards the shed. Normally, the electric cables ran in neat, parallel lines along the lower kitchen wall, like so many silver pythons. Now they were twisted and torn, as if a small bomb had gone off in their midst. Naked copper gleamed in the fluorescent light. Childs and Palmer were bent over them, examining the damage. "Auxiliary power line," Childs muttered angrily as he looked at a particular cable. "That's why the backup never came on. Or the storage batteries either." "Auxiliary cables," Palmer repeated. He leaned closer, feeling betrayed. "Been cut by somebody." "Cut? Bullshit." Childs straightened and stared around the deserted kitchen. He missed the familiar cooking smells and the friendly cacophony of Knowles' stereo. "Been pulled apart." "Can we fix them?" "Probably. Cut off the torn ends and put in clean splices. If we get the time to." He turned to leave. "Come on. I said the reserve batteries were probably all right. I want to make sure." They headed for supply. In spite of the intensifying gale, Macready and Knowles managed to reach the top of the little hill. The shed provided some protection from the growing storm. It was very dark. The feeble light from the main compound was completely obliterated by blowing snow. Macready gestured, and Knowles took up a ready stance on the far side of the doorway. Reaching out with a gloved hand, the pilot flipped up the heavy latch. Then he took a deep breath, shoved the door open, and stepped inside, holding a burning flare in front of him. The first thing he did was trip the light switch just inside the door, but no friendly light flared from the overhead fixture. His gaze turned upward. There was no light fixture. It was gone, along with most of the roof. A few bent corners showed where the weighted metal had been ripped back. Aghast, he strode into his room. The wind was nearly as strong inside as out front, now that the roof was gone. Whether from the battering it had already taken from the wind, or from something else, the interior was a snow-swept wreck. He became aware that Knowles was shouting at him. "Where's the roof?" The cook had been standing in the doorway, staring. Now he walked in and turned in a slow circle as he gazed skyward. "The storm do that?" Macready shook his head. Before they'd forced the door, he'd been frightened. Now he was getting angry. "Possible, but not likely," he told his companion. "Must have weighed 1.5 tons. I had it weighted down against 150-mile-per-hour winds. This little blow we're having isn't anywhere near that strong." They quietly inspected the ruin that had been Macready's home away from home. The oversized chess set was a cracked chunk of red and black plastic. It lay in a corner where it had been thrown. A few of the pieces were visible above the accumulated snow. They lay scattered all over the floor, a pawn here, a broken king there. Knowles kicked over a chair. As he did so, something pale and bloated bounded from beneath. He let out a half scream and instinctively thrust his flare at it. It caught the inflatable lady in the midsection. There was a sharp rapport. Macready whirled at the gunshot-like rapport while Knowles tripped and fell to the floor. Caught by the gusting wind, the deflated latex soared through the missing roof and disappeared into the night. "Shit," Macready muttered, though whether because of the loss of his companion or the false alarm, Knowles couldn't tell. The cook picked himself off the floor, brushing snow from his rumpled parka. "Goddamn women," Macready growled darkly. "Never could tell what they were going to do."